Today, we're talking about the chassis. Now, I know it's not as flashy as an engine build or transmission build, but nonetheless, without one of these, you don't have a car. Your suspension is only as responsive as your frame is rigid, or your skull as intact as your roll cage is. Last time, you got to see the engine, but also the transmission, and those guys are pretty big. By weight, they're over double the old drivetrain, and dimensionally, quite a bit bigger too. If it wasn't obvious, I can't just throw them into the car. I'd put a lot of thought into different options, and that's honestly one of the hardest parts of this build, because genuinely, there are an infinite number of ways I can make this frame and have it still work. The problem is, asking me which path to take is like asking your girlfriend where she wants to eat. To try and keep it simple, I considered reinforcing the old subframe, but the suspension geometry sucks, and I somehow broke it in less than 1,000 miles of use. I considered making a new subframe, just like the old one, but then I literally could not fit a steering rack. Because the old steering was swing arm, they didn't accommodate one in the design. After fitting up the engine, I had come to the last option before the one I actually chose, and that was to terminate the frame behind the engine and run the tubes to the end. Tie that in with the roll cage, and altogether I'd have a pretty good frame. This would be the easiest option that would still work well. The old frame had some rust, but that's no big deal. I can patch it. But this frame is tied into the floor, and it doesn't run the continuous length of the car. It actually stops by the back of the front seats, and the rocker does the rest. Coupled with how it's spot welded 18 gauge, and I figured this needs to go too. So the floor is gone. Oh my goodness. The whole floor just fell. Well, that was the plan. Yep, you literally just cut the borders and it falls out. Like I said, the frame is tied to the floor. I had a bit of trouble getting rid of this rear bulkhead piece. The trailing arm gussets glue it to the rear frame rails, which I want to keep for right now so the car doesn't fall apart until I get the new frame in. While I go to town cutting out the old rocker, here's the plan. I'm going to replace the inside wall of the rocker with 1/8 inch plate, and then weld a tube frame in between them, running between the rear suspension and the engine. Simple enough, right? Were you expecting me to say wrong? I'm not gonna. It is simple. I mean, that doesn't mean I'm not going to mess it up, but that doesn't change how simple it is. I decided on 1/8 inch plate because the current rocker, as you see, has a pretty ugly edge to it from the old floors that I'd have to mess with anyway, not including the rust, but also to mount a frame to it. It'd need gussets to not tear through. Why not make the whole thing a gusset, so I can mount anything I want to it, anywhere? I definitely won't have a bad time welding a butt joint of two vastly different thicknesses of metal, one of which is multiple layers of spot welded sheet, with God only knows what's in between each one. The rocker has been deleted, and I found a mouse nest in there. Only because it caught on fire, and last I checked, metal doesn't normally burn. Speaking of fire, before I go any further, I drained the fuel tank so it wouldn't formerly mouse nest itself when I got around to welding. 1 trillion hours of wire wheeling later, I got the rocker pretty clean of rust, but when this is all done, I'll be treating it with a rust converting coat internally anyway. With that out of the way, I can get around to welding the first plate in. Now I have to make it out of multiple pieces because I only have 24-inch square sheets and I have no money to buy new ones. I had to quit my job to go to school, so I don't know how I'm going to pay for this build. Speaking of money, guess who really loves spending money on things they did not expect to have to buy? Not me. That's because my TIG welder ground clamp decided life was not worth living anymore. I'm compelled to agree. So I had the privilege of replacing it. Back to the actual build, it's time to put the rear bulkhead tube in, and for lack of a better name, this is what I'll be calling it. The tubes I'll be using for the majority of this build are 2-inch outer diameter, 120 wall, 1018 drawn over mandrel tubing. This terminates the middle section of the frame, and will be where my rear suspension is referenced to, so it's pretty important. Now, I use these spaghetti discs because they work great on mill scale, and in my opinion they leave a really nice coarse finish on the metal. They're not so good for large flat pieces because the pressure is all spread out, but they still work and they're amazing on tubes. You guys gotta remember the number of MIG welds I've done are still in the single digits, so obviously I didn't know any better when I had the bright idea to do a second pass on an already perfectly acceptable weld without changing the settings, and then was surprised when it turned out really ugly and cold. So I went over that with TIG and just hope that nobody will see it. With that tube in, I can weld the rest of the plates in, and that I certainly did. Now this rocker panel is a little messed up. It's not a consistent size and it's difficult to get good fitment. I would argue fitment is not only the most important part of welding sheet metal, but any thickness of metal, that I came to learn later. You notice how the camera is a little blurry in the sun? I also learned MIG welding spatter sticks to glass, so not only did it damage my lens, but I need a new windshield. Now I get to begin fabricating the center portion of this frame. It's pretty simple actually. I just made a design that mapped out the driveshaft, transmission, driver's seat, and pedals. With these in place, I knew they'd fit. I drew my tubes around them, put a couple side braces in, and here's my frame. It's just a ladder frame. The hardest part I had with this was actually figuring out how high I wanted my drivetrain to sit in the car, as in how high above or below the frame rails would the crank and transmission shaft center sit. Originally, I had it zeroed, but the sump of these big blocks sits so low because of the crank throw, the thing would have to be a monster truck to have any ground clearance, so I decided on 7 inches above the center of the frame rails. Conveniently, with my tire size of 27.5 inches in diameter, a wheel center of 7 inches above the frame rails also gives me 4.5 inches of ground clearance from the pan, which I actually think is perfect. I've done a decent bit of steel welding, but never large projects like this, and it's safe to say I was not thrilled with the amount of weld distortion I was getting. If a piece was 12 inches long, and I had it perfectly aligned when I began tacking, the piece at its end would be 1/4 inch away from where it should have been, which is pretty noticeable to anyone who has eyes. This is likely exacerbated by my tendency to run TIG as hot as I can without blowing holes in the piece. I didn't realize this until I had already fabricated almost the entire frame because I was making these pieces in pairs. I would cut the angle on the bandsaw, butt them together, align with a digital protractor, tack, check again, still lined up right, then weld in alternating beads from one side to another, only to now find out when I'm done my part is upwards of multiple degrees off. The only saving grace is that these tubes that run the length of the engine are the only ones that need to be really precise. They need to be perpendicular to the rear bulkhead, parallel to each other, and centered between the rockers. As long as that's good, the rest of this frame can still be a bit off and work just fine. It certainly doesn't make me happy, but I'm about a year behind schedule on finishing this car. I actually did end up re-welding these 2 lateral tubes at the front because they didn't fit that well when I mocked them up in the car. I bent them intentionally 1/4 inch off when tacking so they would distort to the correct shape. They were 1/4 inch off originally, and now we're less than 1/16 inch at the end. With that out of the way, I actually get to tack the frame in. There is a bit of a gap on the front braces, but nothing I can't bridge. My ability, or lack thereof, to notch tubes has come back to bite me, and it didn't help that I had the bright idea of putting these tubes on a corner. The problem that I've been having is that all of my measurements are from tube center to tube center, which doesn't work when you have a joint where the tube never makes it to that center and sits on the outside of the tube. You now have to try and figure out what length that tube needs to be cut to work correctly. After a couple measurements to make sure the engine tubes were as centered as I could get them, I welded it. The welds turned out like junk, because my ground clamp decided to pop off the tube it was formerly attached to. I didn't think to check because I just thought I was a bad welder, which I am, just not that bad. So I got to go over those with TIG and replace another ground clamp. Now I'm using engine plates both front and mid to mount my engine, so I designed a relatively simple structure with 3/4 inch 120 wall tubes. Except when I went to drill the plates out to mount to said structure, my drill press wasn't big enough to reach, and I knew better than to do it by hand. I guess we know what I'm doing next. Another adventure